I think we still have some people in, but in the interest of time, I'd like to get started. I'm Lynette Clementson, and I'm the director of Wallace House here at the University of Michigan. Thank you all for coming today, especially for coming on a beautifully sunny day in fall when you could have easily been lured outside. I really appreciate seeing so many of you in this room. Wallace House, as most of you know, is a home for journalism here on the campus of the University of Michigan. We have two programs, the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists, which brings accomplished journalists here to the university each year for an academic year of immersive study. Our fellows now for this year, a class of 17 remarkable journalists, is now into their second month in the fellowship, and they're here in the room. Some of them will have greeted you outside. Our other program is the Livingston Awards for Young Journalists, a program that awards excellence in reporting by journalists under the age of 35, excellence in local reporting, national reporting, and international reporting. And we have this program, Wallace House Presents, where we convene the public in journalism conversations about issues informing our times, built around journalists and the stories they tell, and trying to create greater understanding and engagement about the role of journalism in creating an informed and engaged society. This event that we're having today, we planned months ago, and as it turns out, we have news breaking today that relates to the subject of this. So we're going to start at the beginning by dealing with some of the news today. But first, I want to give some ground rules for the conversation. All of you should have question cards, and if you don't have one, you can raise your hand. Someone will bring one to you. We have our colleagues at Wallace House who will be looking and moving around through the event. And if you do that, if you raise your hand, someone will make sure you get a question card. They will be gathering them as the conversation goes along. We have two Knight Wallace Fellows here, Elliot Woods and Nyla Boudou, who will be collecting those questions and presenting them to our guests when it comes time for an open discussion after our moderated discussion. We also live stream all of our events because we want broad engagement, and so there are people following us online. I want to thank them for their participation as well. For those of you following us digitally through live stream, and for those of you in the room who may not want to use the question cards, you can tweet your comments and questions to us using the hashtag WallaceHouse, and we will make sure that, that your comments and questions are part of the discussion. Here, for anybody using Twitter, are our various handles and ways to follow us. The individual names are of secondary importance. The most important thing to have on your question so that it gets to us is hashtag WallaceHouse. And we usually get quite a bit of engagement through social media, and so I appreciate those of you who will be joining us via live stream and Twitter. We are going to start, before we go into the moderated discussion, I assume that those of you who are interested in Wallace House events also follow the news closely and know that this morning there was an announcement from the president about withdrawing troops from northern Syria. The event that we're having today and all of our events at Wallace House, we plan our events because we want to talk about topical issues, things that are timely, and the topic of this conversation may seem on the surface as if it is about something that happened in the past. It might be easy to think that we are here to talk about policy that was born from something that happened in 2014, but in fact, the policy decisions that we make have active, potentially very dangerous implications for people still being held hostage and for the Foley family who is with us here today. Our moderator for our talk today is Margaux Ewen, Executive Director of the James W. Foley Foundation. I would like to invite Margaux up to the podium and also Diane Foley, the mother of James Foley, and we're going to start allowing them to respond to today's news.
Thank you so much, Lynette, and thank you to the University of Michigan and Wallace House for hosting this event. I just want to introduce Diane Foley, our founder and president of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, which advocates for the freedom of all Americans held hostage abroad and promotes journalist safety worldwide. She's going to read a statement from our foundation on today's news of the U.S. pullback from northeastern Syria.
The James W. Foley Legacy Foundation is deeply concerned by the U.S. government's announced plans to abruptly pull back its forces in northeastern Syria, a region where more than 10,000 ISIS fighters and their families are currently being detained. Among those in Syrian Democratic Forces custody are two British jihadists, Alexander Cody and El-Shafi El-Sheikh, who allegedly were responsible for the captivity, torture, and execution of 4 Americans in 2014. Our son James Foley, journalist Stephen Sotloff, aid worker Peter Kassig, and aid worker Kayla Mueller. Holding these men accountable for their horrific crimes is a critical part of the hostage policy reforms that were made after these innocent Americans were murdered. These reforms not only aim to make the safe return of Americans held hostage a national priority, but also to ensure that those responsible for hostage taking would be held accountable for their crimes as a critical deterrent. The pullback of U.S. forces will not only seriously impede American families' efforts to extradite these men to stand trial in U.S. federal court, but also presents a grave security risk should any of these prisoners escape custody, as the Syrian Democratic Forces now prepare to maintain control without critical U.S. assistance. We hostage families have been waiting years for these suspects to be brought to justice, and they had hopes of seeing them prosecuted as early as the end of this year. This decision sends a message to those who take our citizens hostage that they will not face American justice. We implore President Trump to hold these ISIS fighters accountable for their barbaric human rights crimes against our citizens and to protect our country against the spread of terror should they escape. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaux, and thank you, Diane. And if it wasn't made clear by the statement, you know, when we hear news break, especially news that breaks on Twitter, those of us who spend a lot of time on social media, it may throw us into an outrage loop that is often created by social media. But I just want us all here to recognize that for families impacted, it is not just anger that they feel, it is terror, it is sadness, and it is a sense that closure may never come and justice may never come. So I'm very honored to have our guests here today, and I hope that when you all leave here today, you will pay attention to the news that's unfolded today and think about the conversation that we're about to have. We always start our events with some sort of framing because we are all coming from different places. We're coming from jobs, we're coming from classes, we're coming from walking around campus, we're coming from late lunch. And there's something that brought us all to the event, but we want everybody to start on the same page. And so we started this event with just some facts of the case. We also would like, before we move to the conversation, to start with a video. We had a glitch with our slide presentation. We're going to play the video straight from the web. If you have not seen the documentary Jim, the James Foley story, I really encourage you to watch it. It is difficult to watch, but if it is difficult to watch, it has been even more difficult to live, and it is more difficult to seek justice for. And so we're all reminded of why we're having this conversation today. We'd like to play the trailer from Jim, the James Foley story.
He was trying to figure out where he belonged in I think I was in denial about how dangerous this really was.
I believe that frontline journalism is important. Without these photos and videos, you can't really tell the world how bad it might be.
Four guys with guns put Jim into the back of their van. I didn't know if I was going to see Jim again.
We didn't know we were going to. I was friends.
We have James, he's our friend, we do not want to hurt him.
The shine was starting to come off. It's just that moment of how well can you know anybody?
The longer you are hostage, the better you get at it. You adapt into the situation, and then suddenly this whole thing becomes a part of your life.
I was handcuffed for about 1 week with Jim. We were 19 at one stage. We all asked ourselves, are we going to be able to go through that door? ISIS was on nobody's radar. They were killing people with purpose first, and what could happen in the mountains.
FBI told us to be yourselves, be family.
I never.
We lost all hopes, but James saw the light instead of the dark spots, and the whole group started to lean a little bit against him.
And that's the difference with Jim. He was just you and me, a friendly guy, until testing.
You know, you love your brothers, but how would you put your life in danger?
You know, the thing is, there's physical courage. But if I don't have the moral courage to challenge authority, if I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism.
So again, I encourage you all to watch the documentary, Jim. It's very moving. It's available on multiple streaming platforms, on HBO, on Hulu, on Amazon. And for our conversation today, we're not going to be talking about the event so much, but about the policy that surrounds it and what we do as Americans, what our government does to secure the safe return of American journalists and other workers who are taken hostage while abroad. I'm going to turn things over now to Margaux.
Thank you, Lynette. Diane, the themes we're discussing this evening of advocating for freedom for Americans who are held hostage abroad and promoting journalist safety are really touching on what the mission of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation is. Can you tell us a bit more about how the decision came about to create this foundation a month after your son was killed, and what are the most pressing issues you're dealing with 5 years after that founding?
Well, firstly, after Jim was executed, I was angry. I was really outraged. I really felt that our government had deceived our family and totally abandoned us and our son. So I just felt that we had to do better. That as Americans, we could, in fact, and should, in fact, have the backs of our brave and talented Americans who go out in the world every year. I mean, hundreds of thousands travel the world in various types of work, as you know. So I was appalled. Jim had been detained 2 years, nearly 2 years. And I had quit my job and, been working for those years trying to find someone who would listen to our situation and help. But it turned out our government was very siloed in terms of this issue, that no one was really accountable for the return of Americans. And I think many people in government wanted to help, but their plate was so full, and they just didn't know how to do it. So we felt compelled as a family that we have to do something to help Americans, innocent Americans who were taken hostage. So it was that, coupled with the fact that we really had great people from all over the world sending us money and condolences and strength, prayers. It just seemed like we had to do something. Now, in terms of now, here we are 5 years later, and no one has been held accountable for Jim's death, really, at this point. And the challenge continues, except that I'm much more aware of how big the challenge is. I'm just aware that there aren't just a few Americans taken hostage every year, but in fact hundreds, at some years up to 1,000 Americans. I had no idea how many, because most of these cases are kept classified. Families are told to be very quiet. Corporations also are kept very quiet. So the actual scale of this problem is totally classified. Most of us we have no idea how big the problem is. So as families come to us in need of help, I've become acutely aware of the challenge. The other part of our foundation's challenge is to protect the journalists who bring us the truth, the news. So we've become very passionate about preventative journalist safety education.
Yes, and as the foundation's mission states that we work to advocate for freedom for Americans held hostage, we use that term in a broader sense because we're really talking about Americans who are held by non-state actors like terrorists, but also criminal organizations. But there are many Americans, unfortunately, who are being unlawfully detained by a foreign government, like those Americans detained in Iran or Venezuela, or even places like Syria. So there's a lot of work to be done still on those cases.
A lot. Because the reforms there were some reforms and good things that happened in the wake of these murders, such as an interagency fusion cell, a special envoy, and hostage recovery group at the White House. But these were done only for that smaller group of Americans who are taken hostage by terrorists, criminal gangs, or pirates. So it left out all those who are unjustly detained by governments who hate us and want to use them as political pawns. So that is part of our work now, to see if we can't get our government to help these many other unjust detainees.
And we'll go into a little bit more of the journalist safety issues a little bit later in the discussion. But Joel, as the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, at the time of Jim Foley's captivity, Diane actually came to you to see how your organization could help secure her son's release. Can you explain some of the difficulties you and other American organizations that the Foley family faced in that endeavor due to U.S. policy at the time?
Yeah. Yes. Don't worry. I'm going to cover it. Yeah. I'm Joel Simon. I'm the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And for those of you who don't know who we are and what we do, we're an organization of journalists that defends the rights of journalists around the world. And we've been doing this for over 3 decades. The basic premise is that historically anyway, journalists in this country have worked with the protection of law, the protections of the First Amendment, but there are many journalists around the world who are part of our profession, who are our brothers and sisters, who work in dangerous and repressive environments. We are part of a global information ecosystem, and we owe it to them to support them, to advocate, to fight for them, to use the tools of journalism to keep them safe. I also was a journalist for many years in Latin America, and so the issue of journalists being kidnapped was something I had confronted in my professional life. I had colleagues and friends who were kidnapped in Mexico and in Colombia. Some of these incidents ended quite badly. So this was in my mind when I started at the Committee to Protect Journalists as running the Latin America program some years ago. And as an organization, we grappled with some very difficult cases. Some of you may remember Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter, who was abducted in Pakistan right after 9/11 and was subsequently killed and beheaded by Al-Qaeda. And we mounted, participated in a global campaign to try and win his freedom, which was obviously ultimately unsuccessful. And there were many other cases. So this was an issue that we had grappled with. But in the summer of 2013, this was 18 months after Jim had initially gone missing in Syria, Diane and her husband John came to me because they had decided, for a number of different reasons, including the fact that they felt, as Diane said, abandoned by the U.S. government, that their only hope of bringing Jim home was to figure out a way to pay a ransom. And they had actually received, sometime previously, a note from hostage takers indicating that they wanted to negotiate. I wrote a book on this, and that's the title of my book, We Want to Negotiate, and it's drawn from that note. But there, and I, of course, I had met Jim. I had met him once briefly. He made an indelible impression on me. He was that kind of person. But he was a good friend to many people on our staff who were close to him, and so we were quite aware of the circumstances of his kidnapping. And of course, I wanted to help. But there were challenges. One was that CPJ had a policy that we had for a long time, that we recognize that families particularly will, pay ransom for the return of their loved ones. But we had some concerns that paying ransom, particularly governments paying ransom, could actually make it more dangerous for journalists because it would make journalists more of a target. And I won't go into all the kind of discussions that Diane and John had about this at the time, because this was certainly the U.S. government policy, and I did what I could to help. But after Jim was killed, Diane and I had a sort of heart-to-heart, and she said to me, she said, how do you know this to be true? How do you know that the policy of paying ransom actually increases the risk to journalists and others around the world? And I said to her, Diane, when I think about it, it seems obvious, but I don't really know it to be true. And so Diane challenged me to go out and, as a journalist, to report on that, and that's what I did. And I ultimately wrote a book about U.S. hostage policy. And I ultimately, and I'm sure this will be part of the discussion, came to the opposite conclusion of the assumptions that I began with. And I now believe that this policy, for the most part, is counterproductive. And that's a part of this discussion. We can go into the why, but that was the circumstances under which I initially became involved.
Right. And in your book, you really looked into this policy, how it historically originated in the United States, but you also compared the U.S. approach to that of foreign countries, such as France, Spain, etc. And several journalists from those countries were in captivity with Jim. And as we know, they came home when Jim did not. And so how has your research, have found that did U.S. hostage policy play a role in that result?
Well, first I should say, I should talk about the origins of the U.S. policy. The U.S. policy historically has been that, you know, the U.S. does not negotiate with terrorists, does not make concessions to terrorists. And I was kind of, you know, when I started my research, I was wondering, where did this policy emerge, and how did it come from? And I was finally, there were different people who had different points of view, but I was finally able to figure out the precise origins of this policy, which actually happened in 1973. There was an incident in Sudan where Palestinian terrorists took over the U.S. embassy. I'm sorry, it wasn't the U.S. embassy. It was I believe it was the Saudi embassy in Khartoum, and kidnapped a bunch of diplomats, including a number of U.S. diplomats. And one of their demands was for the release of Sirhan, who was the convicted murderer of Robert F. Kennedy, and a number of other demands. And so right after this happened, President Nixon had planned a press conference. And at that press conference, he was asked, how do you intend to react to these demands made by this group, which is holding these American diplomats hostage? And of course, there was no way that he could, you know, contemplate releasing Sirhan, even if he had the power to do it, who had murdered his Democratic opponent in the election. So he simply said, you know, we won't pay blackmail, we won't negotiate, and as a result of that, there's some debate about this, but the people I talked to were reasonably confident that his proclamation actually led the people who were holding this hostage, the U.S. diplomats hostage, to take them down into a basement and execute them. And after that articulation of this hardline policy, as the person who helped design this policy explained to me, the U.S. policy was written in blood. We doubled down. We basically came up with a whole series of rationalizations to justify the policy, but they were after the fact. And there was a lot of research done, even at the time, contemporaneously, to try and determine whether this approach of not negotiating actually decrease the risk to Americans. And surprisingly, even at the time the policy was being implemented, there was very little research to indicate that there was any correlation between a policy of not negotiating. The British at the time had a policy of not negotiating, and there was very little correlation, very little evidence to suggest there was any correlation. In fact, most countries around the world, or many countries around the world, look at the issue much more pragmatically, particularly the Europeans. There are different approaches in different countries. In my book, I looked specifically at France and Spain, which are sort of on different ends of the continuum. So if the U.S. and the U.K. have this strict policy of not negotiating, France has a policy of sometimes negotiating if there's enough pressure put on the government, which means bringing people out into the street, public protests, etc. And Spain has a policy of basically always negotiating and, for the most part, being willing to pay. And there have been some studies done recently that look at I mentioned that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between policies of no concessions policies, in other words, policies of not negotiating, and the risk to the particular nationals of the country that has that policy, but there's a very strong correlation between survival rates. So countries that do not negotiate have between a 25 and 33% survival rate for their nationals who are taken hostage by terror groups around the world. France has the French hostages survive at a rate of about 75%, and Spain has the best record in the world. Something like 33 Spanish nationals have been taken hostage since 2001, since the sort of onset of the war on terror. Every one of them has come home. Everyone has been ransomed. So there's a 100% survival rate for Spanish hostages, a 25% survival rate for American hostages.
Diane, did you want to interject?
I did, and I guess what was we heard, particularly, it wasn't made clear to us when we were in this situation about the policy. It really wasn't. But as it got nearer the end of Jim's captivity, we heard several times we were actually threatened 3 times by a person from the Obama administration that if, in fact, we dared to raise a ransom, we would, in fact, be prosecuted, that was the case. Secondly, this individual told us for sure that the U.S. would not mount a rescue mission, and our country would not ask a third country to intervene. So the 4 American families, when we did come to entreat the government to help us with this is what we faced. But that aside, I think when I started to look at the evidence for this no concessions policy, there wasn't any. As a matter of fact, during all this time with the Obama administration insisting on this being the policy, the RAND Corporation was telling them, that was at the time, the most recent research, was telling them, in fact, that was not their conclusion, that their conclusion was more aligned with just what Joel said, that in fact Americans fared worse. I mean, well, it stands to reason. If you don't even talk to people who are holding someone captive, there's really no chance for those hostages, if you will. And that was followed up by West Point Combating Terrorism Center research showing the same thing, and then New America, a think tank in Washington, undertook it again because I want to make sure. I mean, our government kept saying this, that we would endanger Americans if we in fact gave concessions or negotiated. So I thought, well, gee, there must be something to this. So we reached out again to this think tank in Washington. They also did an in-depth research showing how different allies, their results from either engaging in captors or not, and the Americans fared worse all around. So it was appalling to see that. In fact, this had become a slogan, and that's what you had say in your book, Joel, that it was a slogan, though, that ended up propelling the policy. So it tied the hands of any of our talented FBI or State Department people who could have helped us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to give, it was a slogan, but the reason it worked as a slogan is because it seems logical. It does seem logical. I mean, it's obvious, right? If you pay, then other people will take hostages, right? I mean, isn't that logical? So this, and it sounds tough, and so it resonated, and it became deeply entrenched in the U.S. outlook, and the U.S., obviously has an interest in resisting, terror groups who might try and coerce the U.S. into changing its policy by taking Americans captive. The problem was that this policy, the logic behind the no concessions policy is that if you don't pay ransom, right, if you never pay ransom, you'll create a disincentive to commit the crime. Right? Well, why would anyone take someone hostage if they're never going to get paid? But that's what I found in my research is it's impossible to create an environment where people don't pay ransom. We know that families will pay. We know that businesses will pay. We know that some governments will pay. And not only that, the U.S. no concessions policy, such as it was, only applied in very limited circumstance. Let me give you some examples. If you are kidnapped domestically in the United States, what is the policy? The policy is not only that we will pay, but around the country, the FBI has stashed in federal reserves up to $300,000 that they provide to kidnappers. It's called ransom is law. Why do we do this? Because they found that paying ransom in domestic cases wins the release of the hostage, and then the next step is you go after the hostage taker. But once the hostage is released, so if you're kidnapped domestically, there's a completely different approach. Secondly, if you're kidnapped by a criminal organization, say a Mexican drug cartel, which behaves very much like a terror organization, they are designated as criminal organizations, perfectly legal to pay. You can pay them. The FBI will sometimes even help you pay them. So that's, let's say an airplane is hijacked, and they make political demands. That is under the authority of the FAA, and they have a different approach, which is just to prioritize the safety of the passengers. So there we will negotiate, and if this is confusing to you, imagine how confusing it is to the hostage takers. So what happened with this policy is they actually created perverse incentives whereby if you took a group of hostages and you knew that some countries were going to pay and some were not, then you could put pressure on the countries that would pay by killing the hostages from the countries that wouldn't, and those hostages didn't have economic value. So instead of decreasing the amount of money going to terror groups around the world, you actually increased it because you created an environment in which they could get larger ransoms. So, I mean, this is really an exercise in the policy making by political slogan instead of taking the time and energy to dig deeply into a complex area, and I was guilty of this myself, where focused research leads you to a conclusion that's contrary to the most intuitive understanding of this issue.
Yeah, so, even though that aspect of the policy about not paying ransom to terrorists did not change in these reforms that you mentioned in your statement, Diane, in 2015, there was a presidential policy directive 30, PPD 30, an executive order that made some changes and created an interagency coordinated body called the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. It also created the role of a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs at the U.S. Department of State and a hostage response group that oversaw those two bodies at the National Security Council that also made high-level policy-making decisions related to hostages. Have there been improvements since those changes to this issue? Because as you said, many Americans have their loved ones currently either being held by terrorist organizations, criminal organizations, or unlawfully detained by foreign governments.
Well, the 2015 changes, I am told, were historic. So I am told that was a huge shift. The fact that we would go from a siloed approach to the return of our citizens to an interagency one. So, but again, as I said before, that is only for that small group of Americans taken hostage by criminal gangs, terrorist groups, or pirates. It did not apply to any of the hundreds of people who are unjustly detained by governments like Turkey, Iran, Venezuela, etc. So that is why we hired Margaux. We're working full-time in Washington because there are hundreds of Americans who need our help. Our policy is not protecting them. It's not the return of our citizens in many cases is not being prioritized. Many times their captivity is being used as a political tool, and that's what these countries who hate us know. They're shrewd. They know that it's a great way to gain leverage over our country to take our citizens, particularly those who are blatantly innocent, like the Princeton graduate student Wang. He's been going to be 3 years now in detention. He had a legal student visa to study in Iran, and he was detained, and he's being held, and he is held hostage, partly in this horrible environment. There are so many cases. In Venezuela, 6 Citco executives from the United States were lured to Venezuela by Maduro to, a meeting where they were all taken hostage. They were just taken. This is happening more and more around the world. There are many examples, unfortunately.
And I would invite anyone here to take a look at the report that the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation put out earlier this year, which is the first non-governmental assessment of this U.S. hostage policy change from 2015. It's called Bringing Americans Home, and it is from the perspective of former hostages, their families, And it also addresses this gap for unlawful detainees that don't benefit from the same information sharing and transparency that the reform was supposed to create. And so essentially, that's the work that the Foley Foundation is trying to achieve to address those gaps. Joel, do you think, from going back to your book, what are some lessons learned that from these other countries where the U.S. government might be able to take some examples and improve the situation for its citizens to bring them home?
Well, I think there are some things that, if you look at the European countries, what they do well, but nobody has figured out the perfect. This is a problem from hell. So it's not like some countries just figured it out. But I think the one thing that the Europeans and even the British, to a certain extent, who have a very strict no concessions policy, where the Americans have failed. They're doing better, but historically they've failed. Is no American citizen should feel alone without the support of their government when they are going through a circumstance like this. I mean, that is cruel and inhuman to leave families to grapple with these. Not only has the American government failed to support them, as Diane mentioned, it has put obstacles in their path, threatening to put American families in jail for seeking the return of their loved one. This is outrageous. And the Europeans have a much more, not perfect, but a much more humane approach to this issue, including the British. The British have a no concessions policy, but they treat the families a lot better. They have historically done that. They've brought the families of hostages to London. They've often had brief meetings with the Prime Minister. They've done a better job of providing information, of sharing with them, of even explaining the policy. I interviewed a Spanish official in my book, who was in charge of this policy under a previous government, and she, that was the thing that she expressed, and many other people in Spain expressed to me, which was, the cruelty of the American policy. What do the Europeans do that I think, Americans should not emulate? I think that hostage taking is what one expert called it. It's political dynamite, because these aren't huge numbers, as Diane mentioned. It's a much larger number than we realize, but it's not a huge number of people. But hostage taking has this incredible ability to, it just hits us emotionally. And it makes us feel vulnerable and angry, and so governments can manipulate us into taking action that may be antithetical to our strategic interests, or providing money to terror groups that they use for terrible purposes. So what the Europeans do wrong is they very publicly engage in the negotiations. And what that does is it drives up the ransom demands, because if the hostage takers realize they're negotiating with the government, their demands are going to go up. And if their demands, if the price goes up, then it goes up across the board. And it goes up for criminal kidnappings, and it goes up to the point where other families who may not have the support with their government can't possibly pay these multi-million-dollar ransoms. So to me, the best solution is governments need to be involved, but they often need to hide their involvement. And they need to support the families fully, and they need to be creative. And they need to always keep in mind the human dimension of this problem and balance the human dimension with the strategic interests. And I think this is what the Obama administration got wrong. They were so focused on the strategic considerations that they forgot to focus on the human dimension of this problem, and they left the families in a terrible, vulnerable position.
I so agree with that. And I also think, how our government so shrewdly will form coalitions for war, for example. In this particular instance, between 2012 and 2013, ISIS gathered quite a group. There were about 18 Western hostages held altogether. So and that's partly why Joel so skillfully looked at those same allies that were all together and how different our approaches were. Imagine if there had been an international coalition that if we had come together as a international community to address this, they might all be home, So that was, not even considered. That every single country took it upon themselves individually to handle the situation, which really left no chance for the British and American captives.
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to add, that there's this sort of false dichotomy between, concessions and no concessions, and it's not really about whether the governments pay or they don't pay. In most cases, the European governments actually deny they pay, and they may technically not be paying because they're directing some other resource. So really, what it comes down to is, does the government support the efforts of the families and the loved ones to raise the money necessary to bring the hostage home, especially when this is in the strategic interest of the particular country, or do they thwart them? And that I think is the more appropriate framework.
And just one other point, I think it's important to say that it's not always about ransom. I think particularly had we come together as an international community, there are ways to sanction groups. There are other points of leverage. I think the point is, and in Joel's book, is we must negotiate. We must find out what people want, and then shrewdly figure out how can we negotiate on behalf of our citizens. And the other thing I think, just one other quick thing, I'm sorry. Yeah. No, there are just so many issues, but the Obama administration missed the opportunity to really find out what ISIS was doing. That by neglecting this issue, putting it aside, looking at the other issues in the region, they were caught totally unaware about how they plan to use the American hostages, and did not receive the intelligence and the information that would have helped them to know how strong they were becoming and a threat to our country.
And on that point about the United States government, either they're going to help the families or they're going to thwart their efforts. There are a lot of third parties that come into this, whether there be human rights attorneys or security firms, insurance firms who have provided kidnap and ransom policy. Can you talk a little bit more about their role?
Sure. And I think the fundamental point here is, are you looking for creative solutions? Or are you trapped by a policy that limits your options? When you should be looking at every possible option. And keep in mind that again, this is a common sense issue. If somebody had something you wanted desperately and you were trying to get that thing, your opening posture would not be, we won't negotiate. You would of course engage in, maybe you couldn't meet the demands, but of course you would do everything you could to understand what those demands were, and so at least you could make an informed decision. And now I forgot the question you initially asked.
The role of security companies and insurance.
One thing that I also looked at in my book is that there is something called kidnapping and ransom insurance. And most of you, if you haven't worked in places around the world, or even if you have probably not heard of this. It's because one of the requirements of kidnapping and ransom insurance, it's supposed to be a secret from the person who's insured. But basically, the way it works, and it's most major U.S. companies or international companies have kidnapping and ransom insurance for their employees, and basically the way it works is that you have a policy, and the policy will reimburse the individual, if it's a wealthy family, for example, or the company, for the ransom once it is paid. So you have to actually raise the money to pay the ransom, which creates the which creates a real negotiation, because if you pay the ransom too quickly, you probably are going to get hit up for a second ransom, because the kidnappers are going to say, well, that was easy, we obviously didn't ask for enough. So you have to engage in some sort of negotiation that's credible. And so these firms, sell this insurance that makes it possible for companies, say media organizations or companies that are providing humanitarian aid, or not companies, rather, nonprofit organizations or international organizations or companies that work in high-risk environments to deploy their people into this setting and provide some what's called duty of care, some reasonable, and if you have this insurance and you are kidnapped, the insurance policy will cover professional negotiators. And the track record of these kidnapping and ransom insurance and this responders, as they're called, the negotiators, crisis responders, is quite good. But again, we get back to this limitation, which is, and it's completely arbitrary when you talk to them, if you are insured and you have a policy, your family say, and you are kidnapped, and they don't know who's kidnapped you. So initially they think it's a criminal organization. Okay, your policy will cover you. You can pay the ransom. You'll be reimbursed. You'll have a crisis response person who will help you. You will have the support of your government. Most of those cases end well. If, however, it is determined that you are held by a terror group, what's called a proscribed group, under various international legal arrangements, then it becomes illegal to pay the ransom, and the policy is essentially voided. You will not be reimbursed if you do pay, and their ability to support you is limited, and these determinations, which are life and death determinations, are often quite arbitrary.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. Obviously, this issue is impacting many types of different Americans, whether they be aid workers, businessmen and women, travelers, tourists, but it also impacts journalists. Like Jim was a journalist, and there is one American journalist right now being detained in Syria since 2012. That's Austin Tice, and we're all wearing pins to support him today. I was wondering, Joel, you could paint a picture for us, given the work that the Committee to Protect Journalists does to raise awareness about threats against journalists and press freedom around the world, but also here at home. What is the current climate for journalists in the world? What risks are they facing, and what steps need to be taken in order to keep them safe?
Well, Margaux, as you mentioned, our job at the Committee to Protect Journalists, one of the things we do is research and documentation, and we've been doing detailed documentation of journalists, press freedom violations committed against journalists since 1992. So we have a baseline and we have data, and I'm sorry to report that this is the worst moment in recent history in terms of attacks against journalists. There are record numbers of journalists imprisoned around the world for the last several years. There's escalating levels of violence. I'm sure you're all familiar with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist and columnist for the Washington Post, who was murdered inside the Saudi embassy in Istanbul just over a year ago. And this is an emblematic case that certainly galvanized the world's attention. Why is this happening? I mean, there's so many reasons. Some of them go back to the particular moment that Jim and his colleagues who were held hostage in Syria lived through, a time when technology was radically transforming the information environment, and journalists who were once able to use their collective information monopoly, as I like to refer to it, as a way of basically making themselves useful to groups that might want to do them harm. Well, that just sort of disappeared, and so the kind of risk to those journalists dramatically increased. And then you have the threat that on the other side, you have governments around the world, particularly in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, when people took to the street and were protesting, and governments recognized that the free circulation of information, which was difficult to control, represented a threat to them, and then we saw a global crackdown on journalists and free expression in response to that. And then you have a new dynamic today, which is the rise of this new generation of authoritarian leaders who are undermining the role of the press, particularly in democratic countries, and President Trump is certainly among them. And I think that the kind that we could there's some real risks to journalists in this country. Not all of them attributable to President Trump, of course. There's the murder of the journalist of the Capital Gazette in Maryland. There are increasing, there've been threats to newsrooms. For example, the Boston Globe. There's been the pipe bombs that were fake pipe bombs alleged, sent to CNN. There's lots of emerging threats to journalists, to their physical integrity. But most journalists in this country are not deterred by the kind of language that President Trump uses when he talks about the media, calling them fake news and enemies of the people. They're going about doing their reporting. Where that kind of rhetoric does the most damage, as A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, noted in an op-ed published a couple weeks ago, is around the world. Because it empowers authoritarian leaders and it undermines, to a huge degree, U.S. influence and credibility around the world. The U.S. is no longer able to effectively advocate for press freedom and the rights of journalists and to use its influence to secure better treatment. And there are certainly governments around the world which are adopting, quote unquote, fake news laws. Their attitude is, all President Trump does is talk about how bad fake news. We're doing something about it. We're criminalizing fake news and putting journalists in jail. So you put all these things together, and that's really why we're living through an unprecedented moment in terms of threats against journalists and press freedom around the world.
And of course, the reaction shouldn't be that people are deterred from practicing journalism because it's such an important public service. So we know there's a lot of initiatives out there to try and prepare journalists for this climate, and that the Foley Foundation has developed safety curricula for graduate journalism schools and is now piloting an undergraduate curriculum with Marquette University for this fall. Diane, can you tell us a little bit more about what the foundation wants to achieve, with this particular focus on student journalists or people who maybe don't want to be in the profession but might be starting to be interested in these courses and could use those skills in the rest of their professions?
Definitely. I have come to know, I never really recognized how critical investigative journalists are to our freedom. I really didn't. I mean, I'm a nurse. I had no clue. So I have come to understand that speaking truth to power is how we are kept free, truly. And that it is essential that we have a free press. So what do we do? And I think it's what's been frightening, as Joel has said, a lot of different people, be they good and bad actors, have realized that they can handle their own communications. They can go directly to the press via social media or a blog or a video. And so that journalists, they were trying to circumvent journalists. And therefore, journalists are hugely at risk and often targeted because they're giving their in-depth investigative view of the truth as opposed to maybe the message that the person wants or the group wants the world to hear. Therefore, we have become quite passionate about wanting to help educate any aspiring young journalists or international workers that not only should they be really excellent at their craft, be it as an aid worker, a foreign service, or a journalist, but that they also should be expert at digital security, at risk assessment, so that they can keep themselves, their sources, the people they work with secure. So that's why we're working with universities. That's why we're so pleased to be here at Michigan.
Right, and both of your organizations have also played a role in this collective effort to strengthen protections for independent journalists or freelancers because they're also so often putting themselves at risk to cover news in dangerous places like Syria. Jim was a freelancer, and you're both on the board of the A Culture of Safety Alliance, the ACOS Alliance, which encourages media outlets to refrain from hiring freelancers until they've received hostile environment and first aid training or other similar safety training to ensure they have access to insurance, and also that editors who send journalists on assignment understand the risks and they have safety training of their own. So that's also something that is really important to both of your organizations.
Yes, I mean, that was really a historic alliance. I mean, to bring media companies together with press NGOs on behalf of the growing group of freelance journalists who really don't have those basic things, that don't have money for safe accommodations, translators, drivers, don't have security backup insurance, all of these things.
Yeah, and I mean, Diane is absolutely right, and this is part of Jim's legacy. And I also want to explain a little bit about how it changed the Committee to Protect Journalists and the work that we do. In the aftermath of Jim's murder and Stephen Sotloff's murder and the other aid workers who were killed along with them, CPJ created an emergencies department and an emergency response team, and we brought on a safety expert, and we actually created a fellowship in honor to honor Jim's memory called the James Foley Fellow. And that person is part of our emergencies team. And the work that this, the understanding, CPJ historically has been an advocacy organization, but we recognized that there are many circumstances in which advocacy is insufficient. Really what we need to do is be out there providing journalists with the safety information they need to stay safe. And so we're part of this alliance. We're working hand in glove with the Foley Foundation and expanding our work in this area. And I want to say that this is not, some, I mean, we're the Committee to Protect Journalists. We're journalists, so these are our colleagues, and so we feel a very strong identity towards them. But I want to explain that this is, I think, is relevant to everyone in this room. This is not, some sort of special pleading, or it's not, merely altruistic. There's a sort of self-interest in this, because we all know how information and news gathering has changed. And we all know that around the world, more and more frontline news is being reported by freelancers, and even more importantly by local journalists working in their own countries who are supplying information that is then incorporated into global reports. And what these people, therefore, are putting their lives on the line to bring us the news and information we need about the world in order to make informed decisions about our lives. And we owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves to ensure that they can do this work with a modicum of safety. And that's what the CPJ Emergency Response Team and Emergencies Department is all about.
So I think we have some questions from the audience now.
No, I'm just waiting to see if it's on. I had to turn it on. Okay. Okay, there we go. So we had a couple questions, so I'm going to, similar questions, I'm going to combine them into this one question. Do you think hostages fare worse because they are American, and America is the enemy of jihadists in a way that countries like Spain and Denmark are not?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we are hated in the world, unfortunately, at this moment in time. Absolutely. I think Westerners are targeted anyway, because of various Western coalitions, but absolutely. I think once they found out Jim was American, he had one of the worst treatments of any of the hostages.
I'm going to say that it was certainly the case in Syria, and it's certainly the case in places where the U.S. is involved in active conflict. But in other places, at least historically, being an American has provided a certain level of protection, because the U.S. There are consequences, political consequences, that groups may not want to endure if they target an American. So I mean, it depends on the circumstances and depends on the environment, but there are certainly many cases around the world, many places around the world where being an American is a liability.
This question comes from another journalist. According to Le Monde, France has paid $58 million to hostage takers, chiefly in the Sahara region. Tens of millions were paid directly to Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, in the Islamic Maghreb. AQIM itself says the money was used to buy weapons and to expand operations. By the time I arrived in the Sahara to report in 2013, I faced a greatly expanded and well-financed kidnapping machine. How can we pay ransoms without creating incentives to kidnap persons like me?
Correct. That's exactly the problem with the, this is something I grappled with. The best case against paying ransom is not that it puts a target on the nationals of a particular country, even AQIM, which is targeting Westerners in the Sahara region. They probably were just grabbing Westerners without having a sense of what their nationality was and then sorting them out. So the argument that, whether a particular country pays or does not pay ransom makes the citizens of that country more or less of a target, there's not a lot of evidence of that. But the real argument against paying ransom is that it's a source of financing for these terror groups, which are primarily targeting citizens of the countries in which they're operating and wreaking terrible havoc. So that's why I think there's no simple solution, but the best policy is one that recognizes that you really can't walk away and have a no concessions policy. You have to figure out a way to pay, but you have to pay as little as possible. And what France did in North Africa was basically, through its very public engagement around these issues, make clear that the government was going to step in and pay very high ransoms. And that, I think, unquestionably, made hostage taking more attractive and helped finance some of these terror groups. So there isn't a simple solution, but I do think that the goal has to be, and the goal that everyone agrees upon, is to reduce the ransom payments so that these groups do not have access to that kind of financing.
And I would just, I certainly concur with that, Joel. I think a lot of the solution is more of an international approach to this issue, because since we know that some sort of negotiation is necessary to, in fact, have the return of our citizens even a possibility, that should we be able, if there were more of a international approach, we could hopefully keep ransoms down and make it not as much of a funding source, because obviously that's a huge problem. We certainly don't want that.
This is a question we got on Twitter. We've been talking a lot about stateless actors, but this question was actually about how you would approach negotiating with a government such as Venezuela's Maduro regime.
Well, I would say this. That this whole framework around non-state actors, we don't negotiate, does not. I outlined all the circumstances in which this does not apply, and one of the situations where it does not apply is with governments. So when Americans are unjustly detained, I sometimes call them judicial hostages, by governments around the world, we do engage, and not uniformly, not necessarily applying the appropriate level of attention to these issues, but we do engage. And I am not going to say there's some magic formula that will resolve the situation in Venezuela, which, where the government has clearly understood that, this strategy can, and Iran has even been more aggressive in this regard, have a coercive impact. But you have to engage. You have to look for solutions. You have to be pragmatic. And you have to take into account the welfare of those Americans who are taken hostage and the needs of their families.
If I might add to that just briefly, the President of the United States actually has a statutory obligation when he learns of an unlawful detention of a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident to inquire and find a way to secure that American citizen's release. Now, the exact piece of legislation eludes me at the moment, but there's actually a lot of force behind that, and that should push the government in terms of what it undertakes in terms of efforts to free these Americans who are unlawfully detained. And what Diane was referring to earlier about this gap for unlawful detainees and what kind of information is shared with them is that often the families are told what the U.S. hostage policy reform families were told is, your loved one is our highest priority. We're working on a lot of different things, but we can't tell you what's going on. And in reality, the government isn't being honest about what their limitations are, what are the policy constraints that they're facing because of the way that they don't want to recognize Maduro's government in this example, or the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, for example. These things impact whether or not the Americans come home, and what really needs to change is that the government needs to start being open and honest with those families about what those limitations are so that they can become creative with their attorney or other countries who might be able to help.
I totally agree. I think the bottom line, as I see it, is that part of our role at the James Foley Legacy Foundation is to prioritize the return of our Americans, that they at least get on the list of negotiables when we engage with other countries, such as Venezuela, and to make sure that they're at the top of the list, not the bottom, and that is a priority for our government, when in practice it has not, certainly not when Jim was detained.
So just to follow up, is CPJ or the Foley Foundation directly involved in any negotiations with the Venezuelan government right now?
No, the Foley Foundation doesn't engage with foreign government. Our role is really to serve as a U.S. hostage policy watchdog. We are in charge of trying to make sure our U.S. government is doing everything in its power to free American citizens and communicate with those families and engage with them in a transparent way.
And with third-party experts, because sometimes the solutions are not anything our government can do, but to have the candor to bring in third-party experts like Joel, in a lot of cases, a lot of journalists around the world, pro bono attorneys,
Groups like the Richardson Center,
Yes.
which also do, there are some groups that do negotiate. Governor Bill Richardson has worked a lot on cases and helped bring Otto Warmbier home, for example.
And so that's why we try to be a place where we can, desperate families can find people who can find different strategies to bring, but we don't personally engage.
And what
them.
about CPJ?
Well, yeah, I mean, we will engage, not necessarily on behalf of Americans, but, repressive governments around the world that put journalists in jail, we engage all the time with those governments. I mean, I've met with, with President Erdogan in Turkey, and specifically raised the issue of, the unjust detention of journalists, the arrest. Turkey's the world's leading jailer of journalists. So it's certainly within our mandate. And, if we have an opportunity to, I wouldn't call it negotiating necessarily, because what do we have to offer? But engaging with governments that put journalists in jail, including American journalists, is something we do on a regular basis.
Okay, this is a question from the audience. Does memorializing Jim's working life encourage or discourage more journalists to become war correspondents?
Good question. I think, we do use the film, the James Foley story, in part of our curriculum for any journalists interested in conflict journalism, so that they might go in with their eyes open and be aware that it's a very high-risk type of journalism. But that is why we're so passionate about safety. Because the reality is that I feel very strongly that we must have journalists to speak truth to power, to tell us what in fact is happening in the world or in our own country. But we have a moral obligation to see that they are safe, that they can pursue the truth in a way that, in fact, protects them and their sources. So we're hoping that I would hope that people aren't afraid to become journalists. I'm sure some are, and that's valid. But that, I mean, it's a patriotic duty. I think if any young people feel called to that, it's a noble profession, in my opinion. But we must keep them safe.
This is another question for the room. I wonder what CPJ or the Foley Foundation knows of British war photojournalist John Cantley, who was imprisoned with Jim and still, as of February, is reportedly alive and being held by ISIS. So it's 6 years, I believe.
Well, you go ahead first.
No, I mean, I think that, yes, the last reports are that John is alive. I'm not, we don't have any confirmation of that. I do know from, being in touch with John's family that, they believe this is a sensitive moment, and it's important that we recognize that his situation is unresolved. But, I don't want to speculate or really say much more about his situation.
Right. The family really doesn't want us to comment on his captivity, really. But we remain hopeful. We really do.
And I think the fact that there isn't a lot of information about his whereabouts underlines the fact that there are so few information sources now in this region because of how many journalists have been targeted or forced to flee, including especially local journalists that were on the ground, where in the past you might have had more information about where he might be.
I really want to ask this one. Okay. So we have time for just 2 more questions. Here's another one from the audience, but before I ask this, I want to just refer back to your comments that sometimes being a U.S. citizen can actually be an advantage in a negotiation situation because governments or non-state actors don't want to increase their jeopardy by dealing with the U.S. government. But the question is, journalists are facing an administration that is undermining their credibility. How does this impact the push to support journalists held hostage? And then I want to add on to that, let's look back again at the Jamal Khashoggi case.
Well, I mean, to say the Trump administration is a paradox is an understatement. But on this particular issue, on the issue of hostages, President Trump has actually prioritized this issue, and many of the families that I speak with, I don't know if you would agree with this, Diane, are appreciative of the level of engagement that they've received from the Trump administration, and Trump has certainly trumpeted his success. Some of the things he does, I think, are actually unhelpful, such as insisting, like trying to extract the political benefit from every hostage that's released by insisting that the released person come and meet him at the Oval Office and submit to these photo ops. And I've talked to some people who've been through that experience and have told me that it was not something that they would have, that they were pressured to do it, and that concerns me a great deal. So Trump, but we do have to recognize that Trump, the Trump administration has made hostage recovery a priority and has had some genuine success. In terms of the broader issue, the kind of leverage that the U.S. has. Let's take it out of the American context, just talking about American journalists, because CPJ, our focus is on all journalists. We want to make sure that all journalists are able to work freely, and the U.S. has historically had some leverage and has applied it, not consistently, not as frequently as we'd like, but it has done so, and that has been advantageous, and that leverage is gone. It is gone. Because there's so many examples of this, but the Trump administration's response to the Jamal Khashoggi murder, the indifference that it's shown. I mean, I would even say that the Trump administration has been an accessory after the fact It has really assisted the Saudi government in covering up that heinous crime. It's reprehensible. And that sends a message to enemies of journalists and enemies of journalism and those who want to persecute journalists that there will be no consequences in terms of their relationship with the United States, at least under the Trump administration. And that's incredibly destructive and detrimental to press freedom.
Absolutely, and I just, to add, the journalist Austin Tice from Texas has been missing 7 years. So, the fact that he's a journalist has not made him a higher priority, for sure. So, the Trump administration has really felt the return of hostages a victory, but on the other hand, has been problematic, certainly, with the press, and made it less safe to be a journalist in the United States, in my opinion.
Our last question comes from a public policy undergraduate student in the room. How are you anticipating how the landscape of hostage taking will evolve in the coming years, and how do you think policymakers and practitioners should proceed?
So I thought about this deeply, and here's my response. Hostage taking comes in waves. If you look at it historically, it's a response to a specific conflict, and the policy is always made or specific set of geopolitical circumstances, and the policy is always made in response to the last hostage crisis. So that is unfortunate. So what can we say for the future? Here's what I will say. Hostage taking is a feature of conflict, and it will never go away. It is part of conflict. There has to be certain forces that align in order for us to see an upsurge in hostage taking. That will take place at some point. We don't know when, and we don't know what the circumstances will be. So I'm not going to make a specific prediction other than to say this is a problem, this is an issue we'll be grappling with in the future. And in terms of policy, I would just say, the lessons from the past are don't lock yourself in a box. Look at the specific circumstance of each hostage taking, be creative, balance the strategic considerations with the humanitarian concerns, look for creative solutions, always, always, always support the families. Those are the lessons for the future.
And that's the way I feel. I just feel that our country should have the backs of our talented Americans that are going out in the world. And if we don't, it's going to be a worsening problem, I think, because it is a tactic that I think a lot of these other governments who hate us and criminal gangs, terrorists, are finding a very useful ploy with our country to, in fact, capture innocent Americans and use them as political pawns for what they want from us. So I think, and that is one of the priorities of the James Foley Legacy Foundation, is to prioritize the return of our citizens, and to, as Margaux said, be a watchdog if you want, but also work with our government and third-party experts to make this a reality.
And there is interest on the Hill for that student who asked that question. There is draft legislation that would seek to codify the current U.S. hostage policy called the Bob Levinson Act, named for the American, what is reported to be the longest held hostage in Iran. And so there's a lot of interest, and we're just trying to continue to raise awareness of this issue and engage the American people to have them push our government to do what must be done to help these Americans. Thank you both.
That's a perfect segue, Margaux, and thank you, Joel and Diane and Margaux, for a stimulating conversation. After these events, we often get questions because people want to know what they can do. As you walked in today, on the table outside, there were a number of pieces of paper that we encourage you to take with you. The Committee to Protect Journalists has information out there about their global work. We have information from the James Foley Foundation and from Wallace House. I want to thank our partners at the Ford School here because they allow us to have these policy discussions here, and so much of what we talk about, even about journalists, and the atmosphere and the rhetoric around journalists is so surface level. And it's just about expressing anger or frustration. And these conversations allow us to go multiple levels deeper and really think about what we can do to impact policy. We're wearing buttons that say Free Austin Tice. Austin Tice is an American journalist who's been captive now for 7 years. 2 weeks ago, if you want to come and move the screen up here, 2 weeks ago, the National Press Club in Washington organized a day of action on Capitol Hill, encouraging people to ask their representatives about Austin Tice. Part of what is helpful in these situations is just keeping a hostage's name public so that there is pressure for our government to engage with the family, to act in their case. And so there's information out there about the Ask About Austin campaign. Certainly, if any of you would like to write a letter to our representatives or anyone, any representative around the country to bring attention to Austin's case, we as a journalism organization certainly support that. And for the James Foley Foundation, I want to draw attention to the James Foley Freedom Run. It's going to be happening this month on October 19th and 20th. There are teams running all around the country and the world. It's a 5K. You can walk or you can run. We have a team of Knight Wallace Fellows who will be running here in Ann Arbor in memory of Jim. And I love this visual that the foundation has created for this run, because certainly they are running for Jim's memory. But when we talk about this issue, we're talking about freedom and safety of the press broadly and about many journalists who have been killed and held captive. And so whoever you want to run for is okay. The act of running or walking and participating in this helps draw attention to this issue. And so this question, I run for Jim, who do you run for? We hope that you'll think about that and encourage people to look at the Foley Foundation website page and put together some groups of people here who will be running for Jim and for the freedom and safety of the press. And we'll be here, as always, after our events to continue talking to you about these issues. We hope to see you at more Wallace House Presents events this year. In your program, we have a list of events that we have coming up. And these conversations are important to us because we're journalists, but as Diane pointed out numerous times, thank you, it's important to us because this is a democracy that we are trying to protect, and journalism is core to protecting our democracy and our freedoms. I have on a button that was inspired by President Schlissel here. It says, "Journalists, champions of the people." We encourage you to take one of these buttons. There's another button out there that simply says, "Uphold democracy, support journalists." Very simple thing to do. And so we thank you for coming today. We thank you for being here and helping to inform us on this topic. And we hope we will bring more Americans home safely. Thank you.